Hey everybody, thanks for joining me on another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. This one has been delayed twice due to some crazy circumstances and things getting forgotten in these COVID times. So I'm really excited for this one. As I've said probably multiple times across social media, this is one I've been looking forward to ever since the idea was kind of floated by our guest today. So the guest today is Stephen Fisher. Him and me have been talking about this for a long time, getting ideas, everything we want to get this going. The slides, like I already said on. Oh, sorry, guys. Sorry, there. Had it on just to see the comments. The slides and everything is good. Lots of good information in the background here. So this is going to be a good show. So thanks everyone for joining us. Hey, Stephen, thanks for joining us today. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Oh yeah, no problem. My pleasure to have you on. This is a really fascinating topic. One I was doing the reading for last week before you had some electrical issues.
Yes, power cut.
Yeah, power cut outage, which is always fun, right? Anyway, so doing the reading on Infatuate, it's always interesting. I mean, the Scheldt is interesting overall. So it's a great topic. And I always like to kind of ask, like, how did you get into, maybe just understanding the landings in the Scheldt and then Infatuate in itself?
Well, for me, I like going to the Netherlands a lot. That's, I suppose, the starting position. Yeah, I've known about Infatuate for a long time, but I've also cycled around the battlefield quite a few times. And every autumn, I tend to go on a cycling holiday around the Netherlands, and spread myself far and wide, and then eventually end up in Arnhem for the anniversaries there. But a couple of times I've been down into the West Kapelle area and down into the south of the Netherlands, and really actively explored it. And then of course there's my landing craft interest, which is what most of this talk is going to be erring towards. Has to be said, it's very much a landing craft focused viewpoint of Infatuate through LCT 7074, the restored landing craft tank outside the D-Day story in Portsmouth, by National Museum of the Royal Navy. And I generally, I suppose, I'm a bit of a landing craft nut. So studying the actions of landing craft, especially landing craft tank, in what was essentially their last big amphibious assault in the Northwest Europe theatre of the war. There were other amphibious operations in the Northwest Theatre across the Rhine, obviously, and then I think the very last one is Operation Anger, the liberation of Arnhem in April 1945. And of course, there were other amphibious operations in the Far East, in Burma, and of course in the Pacific. But in Northwest Europe, this is the last big one for landing craft tanks. And it's also a very big operation for a unit called Support Squadron Eastern Flank, who were very active in Normandy and who I'd studied a lot. And this is actually sort of their death ride, to be honest. So yeah, from many angles, this is just a battle that's absolutely fascinating. It's like a micro D-Day in a way as well. So it's
right. I mean, yeah, you get that kind of sense from doing the reading, but again, you're aware there's too many pictures. I don't think that's possible, but because we'll move through at a pretty good clip. But from what you've shown me in these slides when I was going through them, you get that kind of vibe, right? You get especially the LCTs, how things are developing, the planning, even there's training, right? So it's got so much here that like you said, you hear in Normandy all the time, but this is somewhere else in an entirely different situation. Again, that's probably pretty well known to some of our viewers. I've been doing a lot of Scheldt stuff lately because, again, like you said, it's a fascinating battle. But anyway, so looking at these specifically, it's really good. So I guess we'll just get moving and we'll go from there as we move forward. So this is just one of the quick overshots that you provided to kind of do
stuff for me. Just the intro. But so where to really start with this whole campaign is actually back in the breakout from Normandy. And last week, your speaker, Mark Zuehlke, featured a map very similar to this one, showing the advance up the French and the Belgian coasts on their way to the Netherlands, between August and September and into early October. And it's a very good overview of the advance up the coast and the Cinderella campaign for the Canadian Army. But it only shows a bit of the picture, and there's one aspect of the battlefield that isn't being shown in this map, and that is that big sort of greeny blue one on this map, with It's labelled the English Channel and the Straits of Dover. So whilst you've got this campaign on land, there's this very big campaign happening alongside it in the English Channel. So if you go to the next slide, this is very much the sort of maritime front line just before D-Day, if you like. So we obviously hold control of our own coast very effectively. At this stage, April 1944, we are making serious headway in clearing the English Channel, and we pretty much had our defences down the middle of it, that we could have our convoys travelling up and down the English Channel and through the Straits of Dover even, despite the coastal batteries, and up the east coast in relative safety. Occasional incursions by S-boats, Exercise Tiger is obviously very well known, but in the main, we're holding our own front line very, very successfully, whilst also sweeping clear the other side of the channel, the French side. And then obviously the next big event to happen in June 1944 is D-Day. And if you go to the next slide, giving some deference to the Canadians, this is a Canadian live stream, and to be honest, there's not a huge amount of Canadian involvement in what I'm going to be talking about at Walcheren. But obviously you have a big Canadian presence, Royal Canadian Navy presence for D-Day, operating landing craft flotillas, both landing craft assault, landing craft infantry, such as this one, landing craft infantry large. And very successfully opening up the English Channel, driving a line straight through it to Normandy, and then pushing out from the sides of that spout and clearing over to the eastern half of the English Channel and the western half. And if you go to the next slide, the units that are doing that, amongst the various formations that we have out there, destroyers and submarines, we also have coastal forces, which is my other great area of interest, obviously, in particular the motor torpedo boats, and in this example, the 29th Canadian motor torpedo boat flotilla, who, along with their compatriots in the, oh God, I've forgotten the number now, 51st MTB flotilla, someone will correct me, I'm sure, who are operating dog boats, are doing a very good job of clearing the flanks of the English Channel and generally pushing the enemy aside. And if you look at the next slide, by the end of the Normandy campaign, we are now pretty much in control of the channel. The front line has moved almost all the way over to the North Sea. Aside from the the Channel Islands, which are still holding out a little bit, but up in the top at the Straits of Dover, you know, now we've got a new battlefield in the North Sea, and obviously there's still danger along the tip of the French coast where you've got the cross-channel batteries. And obviously, at this stage, the Allied armies on land are moving all the way up, and they reach Antwerp at the start of September. But the big deal in the English Channel, if you go to the next slide, is the liberation of the batteries on the coast. So Battery Tot and its huge 4 gun emplacements, and that doesn't fall until the start of October. So although Antwerp's already fallen further north, the English Channel is ours, but we don't have clear passage to the North Sea yet until this battery falls. The moment it does, at the start of October, almost all of our landing craft move around to Dover Harbour, and they can start operating across a shorter distance to Boulogne and Calais, not Dunkirk, because that doesn't fall. But at the same time, our motor torpedo boat flotillas can also leave Dover. They can move out of the English Channel altogether because there's no longer a danger of German units trying to force the Straits of Dover. And they can move up to the east coast and start tackling the German forces in the North Sea. So the maritime battlefield has now moved entirely into the North Sea. And this is just about right, because next slide, at exactly this time, we are again falling under attack from German Schnellboat. And in fact, in September, there were 10 attacks on our coastal convoys on the east coast by German Schnellboats. So they'd left the east coast alone through much of early 1944, most of 1943. They hadn't had the resources to attack our east coast convoys. Suddenly in September, they're starting to attack on this new battlefield again. And it's vitally important that we, as the Allies rather, start to clear the North Sea. So it's not just a case of Antwerp falling and then it takes too long to open the Scheldt estuary or anything like that. We also need to claim control of the North Sea. As it was, we were already very good. We were very dominant in the North Sea. Our coastal forces were constantly on the offensive, the Germans primarily on the defensive. But at this vital juncture, as we break out from Normandy, they start to go on the offensive up in the North Sea again. So now we've got a new battlefield, new events happening there. So clearing the Channel ports was essential to that. And now the battlefield is very much moving up. And if you look at the next slide, to this sort of new maritime front line, if you like, from, of course, where we've liberated up to Reskens pretty much, and around the North Dutch coast. So while the armies are on land are making fast headway, at sea it's almost, the maritime battlefield is very, very different to the land battlefield anyway. You never control the land. You know, the victor doesn't keep the battlefield. They go back to port. But there's this new front developing after we've cleared the English Channel.
Yeah, and just for everyone, just keep the bearings. This is the area we're going to be talking about. This is the Scheldt estuary here. So just to keep our bearings here. But this is a great map. I think it's a great way to expand thinking about this. Yes, of course, because we always talk about how the front line moves and the dash out and everything, the breakout, from Normandy, and then the race across the Seine to Antwerp. But again, there's the naval element, which gets forgotten and obviously becomes very important when we get to the Scheldt.
Yeah, and it was very important because it's not just a case of long supply lines from Normandy, where we were obviously piling all of our reinforcements into up until September and October, and then having to drive them via the Red Bull Express all the way up to the front lines. For the naval element as well, after 3 months of constant shuttle service across the English Channel, which is a journey of 100 miles to Normandy, and Le Havre and Cherbourg only just starting to come online as usable ports, and they're still a very long way away. Crews are exhausted. The landing craft themselves are exhausted. They're falling apart quite literally. There are numerous cases of LCT Mark IV specifically cracking down the centre because they can't take this constant use, especially in the English Channel's sort of weather. Even in summer, it's still not always that nice. So it was vital for the Navy to be able to shorten its supply lines as well. So moving up to Dover was a big step in the right direction, even if the port facilities weren't going to be able to cope with the sheer amount of logistical material that's going to have to come through them. So that essentially leads us to, well, next slide, I suppose, which I think is blank, but if we move on to the next bit then, and the whole, sorry, that's a blank one. My little intermission.
There we go. So more focused in on the estuary itself.
So this is our main area. Now, of course, you've got Antwerp down in the bottom right, just off the map, and then you've got the whole peninsula reaching out from the east over towards the west. And of course, now the island of Walcheren is connected to the rest of the peninsula. Physically, all of that land has been reclaimed. But in 1944, of course, it was tidal. There was a causeway. That was the only land joining. And at low tide, it was a sort of mud flat, but certainly not traversable by people. This was very much an island. Walcheren was completely separate from the rest of the landmass, aside from that causeway. So obviously, with an island of that nature, you're going to have an amphibious operation to catch it. And of course, you have to capture Walcheren because to open up the port of Antwerp, and I'm sure everyone who's watching knows this, but in order to make sure that people can access Walcheren, they need to travel through the Scheldt estuary, which is that long, winding, very wide river to the south, just north of the mainland. So if you go on to the next slide.
Sorry, before we do move on, just have a question from Norma, a great supporter of the channel. She's just wondering if that map can be accessible.
So this is from a Dutch website, which I put in the copyright. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Tijdres.
Okay.
Hang on, I'll literally check the web address for you now, because it's one of the ones that I have on my constant bookmarks. So the web address is Topo Tijdres. So just put TOPO in front of that copyright.
Okay,
name.
yeah, and you can send it to me after. That would be great. And I'll put it in the description for after as well.
Brilliant resource for historic maps, and just like Google Earth, you can go through them chronologically and just adjust the time on them.
Yeah, I think I've said this before, but the Dutch resources are pretty awesome. I've used them a lot.
Yeah, they're absolutely incredible
for just things that you would think would be Canadian only, but the Dutch got them. It's great. Yeah.
So this is the Second World War period map. I think this one's from 1941 or something like that.
Right.
But obviously, it hadn't changed a huge amount during the war. And if you move on to the next slide, no problem, Norma. So obviously the land advance had come in from the Antwerp direction. So the Canadians had been moving up the peninsula, capturing the various parcels of land, if you like. And then towards the end of October, there was this amphibious operation from the mainland to the south, capturing land on the islands, and then moving across into the Breskens pocket, as it were, and starting to occupy that land, of course, with troops coming up from the south as well. Yeah. And all of that fighting over the polder that Mark talked about last week. But you can only come at Walcheren from the one direction if you did this entirely by land, and that is across the causeway. So with an island like Walcheren, the only way you're going to be able to capture it is with an amphibious assault. Otherwise, the Germans could just put literally all of their defences in front of the causeway, and I mean, you'll get it eventually. You'll starve the Germans out, but it would take months, if not years, to make this a complete land advance. So almost immediately, there's the realization that this is going to have to be an amphibious operation, and that had occurred to the Royal Navy, in particular Ramsay, as early as September. And all the way through October, there is planning for these operations to land on Walcheren. So there was a long lead-in time to this from the Royal Navy's point of view, and they could start making their plans, and of course working with combined operations with the RAF and the Army to work out the best route to actually capture this island. So if you go on to the next slide, the solution really was obvious, because all of your maritime traffic is going to have to come through the Scheldt estuary, which is that red arrow to the south. So that's the side of the island that you need to capture. There's no point capturing the northern part of the island at first, because that's not going to be a hindrance to your shipping. So really, there's only one part that you're going to need to capture, and that is the south side and the southwest side, which dominate the Scheldt estuary. Now, each one of those little dots on the map is actually a little icon for a gun battery, and those are all individual batteries, each of which has between 2 and 5 guns. So there are numerous ones there. The larger ones are numbered, so there's W11 up at the top there, and then can you move up, Brad? Does it pan over for you? If you move up? Perfect. Yeah. So there's W13. So W13 and W11, they both dominate the entrance to the Scheldt estuary. W15 next to West Kapelle with 5.9-inch guns, that dominates the approaches from the west. And then even the bigger gun batteries up at Domburg, where you have an 8-inch gun battery, they can turn and fire to the south as well. So this island really is bristling with guns. But to make the most of your landings, the best place to land is on the southwest side. So if you look at the next slide, the very obvious solution to capturing this place was to make the assault three-pronged. So obviously coming across the causeway with the Canadian Army, but then also an attack on Flushing, or a friend taught me how to pronounce this, Vlissingen, the Dutch town on the south, and then West Kapelle over on the left side, and then a pincer movement securing that entire southwest side of the island to neutralize all of those gun batteries. There was a fairly large force allocated to this. So on the next slide is a very general overview of the sort of order of battle. Now, the whole thing fell under the domain of 2nd Canadian Corps, but was largely carried out by 52nd Lowland Division. But the main element that they committed to this battle was the 155th Infantry Brigade, with 3 battalions of Scottish troops, accompanied also by a regimental battery, the 1st Mountain Regiment 452 battery. Now, attached to 52nd Lowland Division for this operation were the commandos. So this was 4 Special Service Brigade, which was made up of 4 individual commando troops, which are about the size of an infantry battalion. It's easier just to think of them as battalions, even though they are slightly differently organized and a little bit smaller. So the key components for them were 41, 47 and 48 Royal Marine Commandos, 4 Commando who had just been transferred from 1st Special Service Brigade, and then elements of 10 Inter-Allied Commando. Inter-Allied Commando was a commando made up of various foreign nationals, Belgians, French, Dutch troops, who were all formed into individual troops within this one commando unit. And they very rarely fought as one complete unit, because what tended to happen was their troops were distributed amongst other units for specific operations, much as what was happening here. So 2 troops were attached to 4 Special Service Brigade for this operation. I should add, it was still Special Service Brigade at this point in time. It wasn't until December that they changed it to Commando Brigade and got rid of the hated SS Brigade that they were known as.
A bit of a PR issue there.
Yes, nobody liked it, I think, from the moment of its introduction. And they were also joined by 30th Armoured Brigade, which was one of the brigades of 79th Armoured Division, who would be primarily operating the Hobart's Funnies, the AVREs, the Minesweeping Sherman crab flails, and also the Buffaloes that would be used in this operation.
And there's some great photos of those coming up, which I really like.
So this is your fairly typical overview order of battle, if you like, for the operation. And this is the one that people are most familiar with. I haven't included every single unit, but this is pretty much the setup. And this leads to a lot of people thinking that the commander for Operation Infatuate, or the 2 Operation Infatuates, if you like, Operation Infatuate 1 and Operation Infatuate 2, would have been either the commander of 52nd Lowland Division, which is Edmund Hakewell Smith, or maybe Brigadier McLaren from 155 Infantry Brigade, or maybe Brigadier Lester, Jumbo Lester from 4 Special Service Brigade. People tend to think of those as being the commanders, but really, no, they weren't. The primary commander for Operation Infatuates 1 and 2 are Royal Navy officers, because this is an amphibious operation. So if you go to the next slide, there's a big up the Navy again. Your primary commanders for this operation, the people who have overall control and authority over what is going to happen during the vital stage, the amphibious bit of this operation. You have Captain Anthony Pugsley on the left. Now, he had worked with the Canadians before. In fact, he was the commander of Assault Force J1 at Juno Beach. So he was in charge of everything that was happening on Mike beaches to the west and around Courcelles. So he was essentially the naval force commander for the opening leading waves on Juno Beach. He was very competent. He knew what he was doing. Regular Royal Navy officer since before the war, rank of captain, which is quite high. So he knew exactly what he was doing. And when he was given this job, he was deemed to be one of the most suitable people to do it. And then on the right, he knew that he would need a sort of deputy, because this amphibious operation was being split over 2 different locations. So he wouldn't be able to exercise control of one or the other, depending on which one that he was primarily sort of operating with. But he was very lucky when during the build-up period to this in October, he was in Belgium, and he came across another Royal Navy officer who he describes in his memoir, which is very good, by the way, Destroyer Man by Pugsley.
Sorry, hold up. Put that back up. We'll get a closer view there.
There we go.
There we go.
Very good book. And he describes how he came across a fellow Royal Navy officer who was in an armoured car, generally sort of hanging around, wasn't sure. He didn't have an active command at the time, and that's the gent on the right, who I'm sure everyone is familiar with, but probably hasn't seen a photo of him. That's Captain Colin Maud. And of course, most people think of Kenneth More when they think of Colin Maud, because Kenneth More plays him in The Longest Day. He was the beachmaster on Juno. He's depicted as being on sword in The Longest Day, but ignore that, he was a junior. Very well-known personality, very fiery personality, and he had nothing else to do. So Pugsley took him on command and basically deputized him to oversee what was going to happen in Infatuate 1 for the landings at Vlissingen. So these really are the two primary characters in the amphibious assault. They're the ones who have authority. Pugsley was the person who was going to make the decision as to whether or not the landings at West Kapelle would actually go ahead, and that decision was on him up until about 8 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of November. And the reason, of course, that you've got naval officers in charge is this big naval element. So if you go to the next slide, the other order of battle, the one that people tend to forget, of course, is the naval element to this. And there was a brand new command formed, Force T. Now, Pugsley had a bit of a struggle with this. He basically was given this new command, Force T, and then told to take as much as he liked from Force J, which of course had been at Juno Beach, which was a bit of an awkward position for him. You know, he had to then basically tell somebody else, the commander of Force J, I want all of your ships. But it would have been easier if he'd just been given Force J and then gone and done Infatuate that way. But naval command works in mysterious ways. But anyway, he created two primary units, HLCA squadron, which is made of 6 landing craft assault flotillas, each of about 12 landing craft assault, and NLCT squadron made of 4 landing craft tank flotillas. 4 LCT flotilla is a Mark III landing craft, just like LCT 7074 in Portsmouth. The remainders, 20, 22 and 47, they're all Mark IV landing craft tank, a bit more advanced, but the Mark IIIs are no less capable, so they're all very good vessels. They also had 201 LCIS flotilla, that's landing craft infantry small. They'd worked with the commandos before. Those are the vessels that Lord Lovett and his commandos landed from on Sword Beach, and also 48 Commando landed from on Juno Beach. And then also attached to that, you had the support squadron eastern flank. Now, this is all of the miscellany of landing craft that had been specially fitted with weapons to support landing. So landing craft flak, landing craft gun, we'll come to them in a minute. Yeah. And had operated off the east side of the invasion beaches on what was known as the Trout Line, defending Sword and Juno beaches from German incursions coming in from the Havre, right the way through until the fall of the German channel ports, basically. And there's a couple of other units, I haven't touched on all of them, but this is the primary formation of Force T, and this is the primary delivery method, if you like, for occupying, for assaulting Walcheren. So 2 landings then, and if we look at the next slide, for the landings at Vlissingen, or Flushing, I'll use those interchangeably. Yeah. This is a very different sort of amphibious operation because it's a very short distance. So I took this photo on one of my trips from Breskens, and you know the Scheldt is pretty wide, but you know you can see the coast on the other side. So this is almost like a very, very wide river crossing in some ways. It also presented a bit of a problem for an amphibious assault because Breskens wasn't a place that you could get landing craft into by sea, because they'll be observed by the gun batteries across the other side of the Scheldt in Flushing and along the estuary, as I showed you. So there was no way to get landing craft tank or any large major landing craft into Breskens Harbour to load them and then take troops across to Flushing. So the only vessels that were used for this part of the operation, Infatuate 1, if you go to the next slide, were the very small and light landing craft assault. So all 4 flotillas, all of HLCA squadron, are sent to Breskens basically by land. So they go to Ostend, they're carried on lorries and then along canals to actually get to Breskens Harbour, where they're used. The first flotilla arrived in advance of the first amphibious operation at the end of October, further down the estuary, and then the other 3 flotillas joined them for this operation. They were joined by a couple, just 2 or 3 landing craft personnel large, which on the next slide you'll see as well. very small little boats, but quite speedy. They don't have a bow ramp. These were going to be used by the tar brush parties who would go in advance to check the landing area just before the primary landings. Because the other problem with Flushing of Vlissingen is that there was no easy way to reconnaissance those beaches without being observed. So although they tried to get across and have a good look at the beaches, really they were reduced to aerial photography and that sort of thing to try and get the best idea. But they did get lucky with finding a good location to land on when I believe it was a police inspector who had escaped from Vlissingen came to Breskens and gave them some advice on where to land. And if we look at the next slide, this is again from that fantastic Dutch website, Tijdrit. Vlissingen very much sits right on the waterfront and is protected by dikes all the way around it, which of course creates quite a high seawall, which is very difficult to attack offensively. Now, one of the things that had happened, of course, is the RAF had bombed bits of it and they'd blown some of the dikes, but that was further to the west, just up in the top left of that map. And that was being done, of course, to flood all of the interior of Walcheren to restrict German movement so that they couldn't reinforce places where the landings were taking place very easily. The destruction of the seawall of Vlissingen made no difference to the actual assault that was going to be carried out. But as you can see, with all of those dikes along the front, there's not very many areas that were easy to land. But this police inspector was able to reveal one location on the next slide on the south side of the town, which was this old harbour, which had become disused and apparently had a huge sort of rubbish tip at the shore end of it. So the thinking was that that would provide a fairly firm surface for vehicles to actually get out of this small little harbour area and give them some firm going. So it is literally just that space next to the Orange Molen between those two breakwaters that are projecting out. And that was given the code name Uncle Beach. And it's still there today, in a way. If you go to the next slide, those two dikes, sorry, not dikes, breakwaters, you can see them, they're still projecting there in the intertidal area, just out. Although the whole wall has been rebuilt there, the harbour is gone, but some of the intertidal remains are still visible. So if you go there at low tide, you can get a sense of what Uncle Beach will have looked like. So much reconnaissance was done in advance, and I've got way too many slides here, haven't I? But the next slide shows a view of it prior to the landings, and it was incredibly small. It was only 100 meters wide because that really was the only place where you could make a landing. The beach to the west, sorry, to the east on the right of this picture, was again had the seawall and was very heavily defended. There were 10 concrete gun emplacements covering that beach, and then over to the west, you're on the left side, you're entering the harbour mouth area for the old dock, and again that is very heavily fortified, a high seawall, and not very many areas to land at all because of dredging to create the harbour mouth entrance. So Uncle Beach really was the only option. So the landing, we can skip this slide. I think it's again you can still see
it's a cool shot. Look at it real quick.
A very similar comparison there. So the landing was going to be right in that narrow little piece of land, and it was all going to have to be done by landing craft assault. Because that is all there was. They could be supported by the Buffaloes, which were operating by then, but they weren't going to be that much use for the assault because they're actually quite noisy, and that was one of the big problems. So the idea for the assault, the timetable, if you like, was going to be a night attack, almost stealthily done, with the tar brush parties landing at 5:45 just to inspect the beach and basically signal the following landing craft where to actually come in to avoid some of the beach defences. So there were stakes, a couple of them were mined, just to try and prevent any landings. This whole thing would be preceded by a massive air raid. and a bombardment from all of the artillery on the south side of the Scheldt estuary. In the event, and basically causing difficulties for the entire operation, there was no air raid because the ground conditions in the UK prevented aircraft from taking off. So instead, there was a very lengthy bombardment that started several fires in the town. And some of the commandos report from their initial landing that this illuminated the site so well that they could see their beach more clearly than in daylight.
Right.
Those commandos that were going to make the initial landing, that was 4 Commando, the Army Commando unit. They were, I think, the only commando unit that had actually gone back to the UK before this operation, because they were withdrawn to the UK in September, and they actually got a period of leave, which none of the other commandos taking part actually managed. They stayed in Europe. But 4 Commando were moved back to the UK, but then they discovered they were being transferred to 4 Special Service Brigade, and then went back to Belgium, where they started preparing for this operation. So this was all done by a landing craft assault. They all take to the water at about 4:30 in the morning, and by 4:45 are making their way out of the harbour. And basically they start waiting in the Scheldt estuary in darkness for this bombardment to basically pin down the defences. And then at 5:45 they go in. Now it's dark at 5:45. There's no great illustrations of this, unfortunately.
No, there would not be. No,
there's a couple of photos from later in the day. So the next slide, I'm pretty certain this is units of 155 Brigade. Loading up for the following waves, probably about 7 o'clock in the morning. I think there's some beach commandos there who are preparing to, improve Uncle Beach for the following waves. And then in the next slide, you get a view of some of them as they make their way across to Vlissingen out of to Breskens Harbour. And a lot of this was filmed. The Army film and photographic units were there in force capturing a lot of this. And so there is some contemporary footage. But again, it's not of the commandos. This is 155 Brigade. I think it's 4th King's Own Scottish Borderers.
Okay.
We're actually landing in this footage. So if we have a look at that, we'll skip it.
Yeah, just brief. I'll have to change.
At night, they very quickly secure the beach. And establish this beachhead, which is very quickly then reinforced by 155 Brigade, first by King's Own Scottish Borderers, and then later in the day, the other 2 battalions also start to arrive as well. Now, from the landing craft perspective, it all went incredibly well, and there were hardly any losses. And if you go to the next slide, one of the things that I've been consulting quite a lot lately is landing craft survivors reports. So whenever a landing craft was sunk and survivors were returned to the UK, they were interrogated and given, they hand over as much detail as they could about the loss of a vessel. And really, they're very brief for the Vlissingen one. I can only find reports of 2 LCA landing craft assault that were actually sunk. And this is the form. So it's a 2-sided form, the basic details: when the vessel was sunk, when you got back to the UK, how you got back to the UK, do you know of anyone who was killed, do you know of any other vessels that were sunk? And then bottom right, there's this little bit for them to comment on what happened. So one of these was actually sunk in Breskens Harbour. So this landing craft had gone back to Breskens. So one of the things that all of the landing craft are sort of having to do is go back and forth across the Scheldt estuary, constantly resupplying and taking more troops over. And they're actually hit by shell fire in Breskens Harbour. So the shelling from the coastal batteries had increased considerably, and the crew were ordered to take cover. I'm not sure what STO is a rank. Oh, sorry, Stoker. Stoker Boville was detailed to inform the crew and troops on another craft nearby. Was wounded, and the vessel sank alongside. There is another landing craft that sank over on the Vlissingen side. So the flotilla was coming into the beach, Uncle Beach, when it received about 5 hits from shore batteries. which damaged one engine, the steering, and the telegraphs. And the coxswain managed to beach the craft on some rocks, where it basically became a total wreck, and the crew were all injured by splinters, but then recovered. And those are the only two landing craft that I can actually find reports of to have been damaged. Now, some of the books, the numerous books that have been written about these landings, suggest that they were struck, but I can't find info on those, which is interesting because most of the accounts I tend to find mentioning that are army accounts, and they just say, oh, the landing craft was sunk, but I haven't seen, I don't know which ones they were, so that's something else I need to investigate further. But the operation, the landings were certainly very successful because the LCA were able to keep bringing more troops over despite German counter batteries from the north firing down on the Scheldt estuary and trying to cut off that link. And for a brief while in the morning, they were able to prevent crossings just through sheer weight of fire from German artillery. But there was never enough artillery fire to stop all reinforcement at all. And so the capture of Vlissingen essentially happens in a series of sort of leapfrog stages. And on the next slide, the first phase on day one, the commandos essentially secure this beachhead spilling out from Uncle Beach and securing the immediate old dock town and forming a beachhead, which I've indicated with the blue lines on both sides. And then on the 2nd of November, they then push further out to the north, which I think is the next slide. Hopefully. 2nd of November, basically 155 brigades start to push beyond the commandos' front line up around the new docks, if you like, whilst the commandos head to the southwest and capture the waterfront areas. And then very early in the morning on the 3rd of November, on the next slide, the commandos push all the way up and take the German HQ further up the coast. And then into the 4th, I think, the 4th of November, on the next slide, 155 Brigade force a crossing across the canal that leads up to Middelkerk and basically secure all of the docks. And by now, Vlissingen is basically secure, and the Allies have a very comprehensive beachhead there. But that's the 4th of November. It took 4 days to clear Vlissingen. And indeed, on the 1st of November, that area was still very, very under threat from German counterattack. So what had happened was, of course, well, I didn't mention this in great detail, but I know it's been mentioned previously in some of your talks. The RAF had bombed Walcheren and breached the dikes, allowing high tide flooding of the inland polder, which is very low lying just below sea level. And so all of Walcheren was pretty much underwater, aside from the coast where the dikes were up above it, and the canal, which you can see on that map leading up to the north, which was slightly higher ground and opened the way to the town in the center of the island. But yeah, prior to capturing all of Vlissingen, there was still the opportunity for Germans to counterattack coming down the coast or down the canal had they wanted to. And this is why you had to have 2 landings at very much the same time. So this one at Vlissingen, and then Operation Infatuate 2, the somewhat more famous operation to capture West Kapelle over on the west side of the island. And this is the one I'm going to talk about a bit more, even though I realize I'm rapidly eating into time. So West Kapelle, this very small little, it's a village really. There's only 2 pubs I can think of from my last trip there, and yeah, it's mainly houses and a couple of campsites. If you look at the next slide in more detail, you can see it is very small. Probably most famous for its lighthouse, which was this very tall tower at the back of the town, and sheltered by this very high dike that goes all the way around the island. But it was in October 1944 that the RAF bombed that dike, exactly where your mouse is now, and the next slide shows exactly where that dike was breached. Just south of the town, you can see the streets of the town just there, and then this huge hole in the dike, literally this earth structure blown apart by bombs. That's not easy to achieve. So the RAF did very well to breach the dikes like that, and they did it at 4 places on the island. And what that allows is for tidal water to flood in and inundate the land inland, and it restricts German movement. Now, this had happened around Vlissingen, but here the Allies were going to exploit it in a different way. They were going to attack that breach and then basically drive through that flooded bit of the dike rather than having to go over it and then spill out and attack West Kapelle and head south from behind the dike rather than having to attack and go straight up it. At Vlissingen, they'd had Uncle Beach, which was suitable for landings, as I said, very narrow, but here they couldn't have landed without breaching the dike. They'd have come up against a high dike wall, and those dikes are very high. And they would have been massacred on the beaches. So this breach was essential to the actual landing. And here, this is where we get a much larger force that's going to land. So the order of battle on the next slide.
Yeah, and here's just a quick shot of it. Yeah, and again, sorry, just jumping in real quick. When the talk with Mark Zuehlke, we talked about very briefly how controversial the bombing of the dikes were, and in his book, he talks about it at great length. Basically, the process and the difficulty that there was against doing so. But it's a good thing to keep in mind.
Hugely controversial thing to do, and basically, it's an awful thing to say, but essentially, the end justified the means because they needed to open Antwerp. If they didn't open Antwerp, then the entire advance into Western Europe would stall. And so in order to achieve that, this really was the only way to secure the island of Walcheren. So controversial, but unfortunately very necessary. So the next slide shows the Allied force that had been allocated to this. So primarily 4 Special Service Brigades with elements of 10 Inter-Allied Commando, but also the primary units of 4 Special Service Brigade, 41, 47 and 48 Royal Marine Commando. They'd all been engaged in D-Day. They'd all been operating in Europe ever since then. They'd rested and recuperated in Belgium through September and October. Primarily October, I suppose. September they were still in operations, but they were competent now. They were fairly new commando units for D-Day. 48 Royal Marine Commando was only formed in February 1944, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
But by now they're battle hardened and they're ready to go. Supported by 30th Armoured Brigade with Hobart's Funnies and the Buffaloes. But there was a Canadian presence, which I thought I'd throw in there. So you had 17 Canadian Light Field Ambulance. Now, if I've got the hierarchy right, I think it was comprised of its own units, but it also had as sub-formations 8 and 9 Canadian Field Surgical Units and a 5th Canadian Field Transfusion Unit. They were going to land with the assault, with the commandos. They were going in right at the start.
Wow.
And then you would have 10 Canadian Field Dressing Station coming later on in the day, much later in the afternoon. And all of this is also being supported by 6 Canadian Field Dressing Station in Ostend, which is a long way away. But that's where all of the landing craft for this operation are coming from, and that's where they're going to go back to. So they had a vital role to play as well, because they would be taking injured parties directly off the beaches and back to Ostend for primary care. Now, the vessels that were assigned to this were led by the flagship HMS Kingsmill, a captain-class frigate, again had been at D-Day. This was Pugsley's command ship. But the primary units, of course, are all landing craft. And basically, there are several different types of landing craft delivery vessels. The landing craft infantry small. Now, these have been used on D-Day. They're sort of motor torpedo boat hulls that have been outfitted for landing operations because they were built by Fairmile, who built the Fairmile motor launchers. They weren't popular. D-Day had proven their weaknesses, which is that they don't have a bow ramp. They have ladder ramps that are pushed off the bow. And in fact, Lieutenant Colonel Moulton of 48 Commando, he refused to use them. He point blank said for Operation Infatuate 2 he wasn't going to use them. Yeah, and so he forced, and so one of the other commandos, the use of a different delivery means, if you like, which was the next slide, was to use the landing craft tank. But rather than delivering armor, as it had done on D-Day, the LCT was going to primarily be tasked with landing infantry. who would land directly from the LCT in Buffaloes.
In Buffalo,
And then the next slide, you'll see some of these Buffaloes.
Yeah, sorry, can I
up.
just stop you there real quick? Because we had
Yeah.
a good question, actually. And I think I have heard this as well. Going back just a bit with the medical units, I thought they had some difficulties, I believe.
They did, yeah. So their areas of setup, I was going to come to a bit later, actually, so we can mention it.
Okay, we can come back to that then. Yeah,
we'll touch on that again in a minute. So yeah, the landing craft tank is going to basically have all of the troops on board already in Buffaloes, and here you can see them loaded up inside one of the LCTs on their way to West Kapelle. And then on the side, you've got the smaller amphibious weasels, and you can't actually fit many Buffaloes into a landing craft tank. So they're pretty much rammed in. All the troops are obviously spectating as they watch the barrage on West Kapelle up in the top left. But they'll get into their Buffaloes, and the landing craft we're basically going to go straight into that breach in the dike and launch the Buffaloes with the troops on board. Now, all of this operation is supported by basically bombardment forces, and the two big ones, or sorry, three big ones, are HMS Warspite, the battleship, 4 turrets of 15-inch guns, but only 2 of those turrets are working. And then 2 monitors, which are shallow draft vessels with big outsized 15-inch guns, HMS Erebus and HMS Roberts, who are going to carry out the bombardment. The problem with those is that they're reliant on spotter aircraft, which would be flying from the UK. And of course, those spotter aircraft couldn't take off in time for the actual landings in the morning of the 1st of November. So a lot of the work for bombarding the coast fell on the support squadron eastern flank, and they were made up of 27 vessels. So the first 2 are the headquarters units, and they're those 2 vessels in the middle, landing craft headquarters. There are 2 of those allocated. Basically, these are command vessels. There's no troop space. It's all been ripped out and fitted with radios and that sort of thing. Marion, keep up, Marion.
You can get lost that map for a long time, I think.
Yeah. And they're basically coordinating the whole thing. The commander of Support Squadron Eastern Flank, Kenneth Sellar, Commander Kenneth Sellar, known as Monkey Sellar, who was a very famous cricketer and rugby player as well. He was the commander of Support Squadron Eastern Flank. He was operating from Landing Craft Headquarters 269, which had been his command vessel on D-Day as well. And under his command, he had 25, if you like, fighting ships. And the first of those were the Landing Craft Flak, which is a landing craft tank that has been modified. So its tank deck has been covered over and fitted with lots and lots of artillery pieces, anti-aircraft artillery pieces. So the next slide shows one of them bristling with 2-pounder pom-poms and 20mm Oerlikons. Really formidable deck of anti-aircraft guns. Now, of course, there isn't much Luftwaffe opposition at this stage, and there hadn't been on D-Day either. And on D-Day and at Walcheren, most of their use would be to obliterate coastal defences rather than keeping an eye out for the Luftwaffe. They're going to be joined by 5 landing craft tank rocket, the very famous rocket ships of D-Day, and the next slide shows the horrific sort of firepower they can unleash. Very heavy, very inaccurate. And they were joined by 6 landing craft gun large, which again are landing craft tanks with the deck decked over, and 2 4.7-inch basically destroyer size naval guns fitted on. So they can get in very close with their shallow bottom and bombard enemy positions. Joining them were another 2 slightly smaller landing craft gun. These were called landing craft gun medium. Now, these are unusual vessels. These are unique in that they're landing craft classified, but in fact they were purpose built as landing craft guns. They're not converted landing craft. They're actually purpose built in this design, and they could be fitted with either with 2 turrets, either with 40, oh god, I forget the caliber of artillery piece, guns, or 17-pounder anti-tank guns, such as have been fitted here on Landing Craft Gun Medium 101. So those are 17-pounder, Firefly artillery pieces, which are great for engaging armor, but also very good for engaging pillboxes and penetrating concrete. So 2 of those were going to accompany the landings. And they were also joined by slightly smaller landing craft guns, small if you like, actually classified as landing craft support, large. This is the same hull as the landing craft infantry that I showed you, the Fairmont built hull. There's a 6-pounder gun in a turret at the front there, and then you've got Oerlikons and 2-pounder and 0.5 Vickers machine guns at the stern. Again, they're just designed to get in really close and give lots of firepower support. And there were another 6 of these operating for the landings. So altogether, you've got 25 fighting ships and 2 support vessels. And up against them are all of these coastal batteries that the Germans have that I showed you on that map. And there are numerous of these all the way along the coast, sporting basically cruiser-sized guns, 5.9-inch guns, a couple of 8-inch guns. There's a photo in the next slide of one of those positions. I think this is W11, actually, at West Kapelle. Now, the idea was that these would be pounded by the RAF just before the landings, but of course that didn't happen because they the fog in Britain prevented them from
we have
off.
a question about that actually from the Great Dominion about why they didn't use walruses.
That's a very good question. I don't know. Pugsley had lobbied that the spotter aircraft should be based in Europe, but they couldn't do that. For one reason or another, they refused to transfer the Spitfires over. Now, walruses, I don't think are actually spotting aircraft. I think they're more reconnaissance aircraft anyway.
As far as I know, and search and rescue kind of thing, but
I mean, certainly Warspite had its own. Whether they were still operating from her by now, I don't know, because Warspite was no longer an active seagoing vessel. She was purely being used for shore bombardment, and by now they worked out a far better system of working with well-trained fighters who knew what they were doing. So the Walrus crew wouldn't have been trained in spotting. But also, Roberts and Erebus didn't have aircraft fitted to them either, so they would have been blind still. So really, it came down to Support Squadron Eastern Flank to provide all of the support for this, and it came down to Pugsley to make a decision: would he proceed without the air support? And he weighed up the risks, and he knew what was at stake, so he went ahead with the operation. So the plan was quite straightforward. And if you go to the next slide, the support squadron Eastern Flank would be divided into 2 forces, the northern flank and the southern flank. And then the landing craft carrying the troops would go straight down the middle. And basically, the Commander Seller's approach was that he discovered at Normandy that basically German shore batteries will fire at whatever is firing at them. If they're being attacked by a vessel, they will attack that vessel back. They won't concentrate on a juicy target if it isn't shooting at them. They will always go for whoever's attacking them. So his plan was very much to draw all of the enemy fire using his own ships, so that the unarmed landing craft tank and landing craft infantry could drive straight down the middle and into the breach. So he knew what this meant, and so did Pugsley. They both knew what they were allowing here. They were basically going to make themselves the targets in order to get the troops into the breach in the dike. And so this was very much a death ride. They would go down on either side and draw as much fire as they possibly could. And so what came to pass was as you might expect, they drew an awful lot of fire on them. Now, one of the things you'll notice on that map is the shoals, the sandbanks in the middle. One of the things that first had to happen as the force approached about 8 o'clock in the morning was to mark those, and that was done by Fairmile motor launchers. And in the next slide, there's a typical Fairmile B. This isn't one that was actually in the West Kapelle operation. This is actually a Canadian Fairmile, which I thought shove in there, just Canadian live stream.
Get that Canadian content in there, yeah.
Yeah, so the Canadian, this is a British design, the Fairmile B, but the Canadians built them in their boatyards as well, and they operated all along your Atlantic coast. But their job for this operation was to go in advance and mark those sandbanks to make sure that none of the landing craft came to grief. And one very good book from the skipper of a Fairmile B is called At Sea Level by Geoffrey Searle. And he was one of those Fairmile commanders. And he marked one of the sandbanks further out. And he gives a very vivid description of what it was like to be marking one of those sandbanks. He also references one of the landing craft commanders at the briefing before the operation. Pugsley pointed at the officer sat next to him and said, Lieutenant Cookson, you'll be marking this sandbank. And Searle thought very much that was like a hand of fate, that he just chose the guy next to him and pointed at him and said, you will mark this sandbank. Lieutenant Cookson was the commander of ML-146, and they went into the nearest sandbank to the shore, and they were pummeled by German artillery fire. Cookson was killed and buried at sea. But the ML stayed in position. The first lieutenant remained on this sandbank with his motor launch being pummeled and turned into a colander until he was actually ordered to withdraw by Pugsley from the command ship. And Searle recounts all of this in quite graphic detail, as does Pugsley in his memoir. But that was the very first sacrifice, if you like, of the day, which is then very quickly followed by many, many more. There's a bit of film of the landing, not of the landing, of the approach by the support squadron. Skip that one. And this is the forces going in, a support squadron on either side, and it's a bit jerky. Crashed. Oh, there we go. Wasted because they all fell into the sea amongst their own landing craft, which is a great shame. But nonetheless, the other landing craft of the support squadron eastern flank, they press ahead. So here's landing craft Flak 37. Now there's a casualty report because she was lost, and in typical sort of British simplicity, there's a very brief description of her loss on the next slide. And this is so typically matter of fact. Craft sustained 7 or 8 hits, then blew up amidships and started sinking. When last seen by survivors, she had a list of about 70 degrees to starboard and the wardroom was on fire. I mean, that doesn't even begin to convey some of the horrors of being on a sinking landing craft. Yeah. Pugsley does a much better job because he chatted with the commanding officer and describes over the course of 2 pages how Lieutenant Carleton, Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, of the commander of landing craft Flak 37, had gone in to be as close as possible to, within a kilometre of his target, so he could pummel it as best as possible. And he starts taking hits at 9:20 from a 6-inch shell, and then more shells come in. One explodes the magazine, holding all of the ammunition, which is when it blows up amidships. And some of the men are lost as another shell plunges into the fuel tank, causing more carnage. And then the vessel is eventually abandoned. A good number of the crew were able to escape, but a good many were lost. And those are Royal Navy sailors and also Royal Marine gunners. In Support Squadron Eastern Flank, there's probably about 1,000 men altogether, and just over half of those are Royal Navy. The other part are all Royal Marine gunners who are manning the weapons on all of these various types of vessel. Yeah. The landing craft gun come in for equal amounts of suffering and go. You can skip the next slide, actually, because I just realised it's a lengthier report. Skip that, yeah. So landing craft gun, they came in for significant pastings as well. And landing craft gun, there were 6 of the larger landing craft gun large, and 2 of those were lost, and 2 were written off. Made completely inoperable and just managed to limp back to Ostend under tow. But it's the smaller landing craft gun medium two of them, LCGM 101 and 102, who had the very roughest job. They were designed to beach, to actually land on the shore and then pummel targets at point blank range with their 17-pounders. And on the next slide, 101 was designed to go in on the north side of the breach in the dike, and 102 on the south side. And that's it's not very favourable to go.
That would be not great.
And so, as you can imagine, there's quite lengthy reports from Landing Craft Gun 101.
Yeah.
And on the next slide, there's a whole sequence of quite famous images.
Right.
So basically, she beached very early at 9:40. The pillbox, which was her target, according to the report that was filed by the commanding officer, the ship was beached at 9:40. The pillbox was about 50 yards in front of the ship. I mean, 50 yards, 50 meters. That is absolutely nothing.
Yep.
The guns were firing rapid salvos, and for the first 2 minutes, all went well. Gradually, however, enemy fire from the beaches reached a climax. Machine gun bullets of all calibers rained on the ship. The starboard gun was damaged, and the port turret, the crew were all wounded. And then the ship was repeatedly hit in the stern and upper works. The galley was smashed, the seamen's and officers' heads were shattered, armor-piercing bullets were passing through the wardroom, while the ship was badly holed along the waterline. Although this fact was not known until the ship came off the beach and was well off to sea. So at 9:50, 5 minutes after the infantry start to touch down, the captain decides to kedge off, and they pull off the beach. And several crew were killed in this action because they had to expose themselves to man the kedge anchor. But they were able to pull off the beach, and the screws were able to then take them back out to sea. And that's when all of this damage below the waterline became evident. And she started taking on water very rapidly and went down by the stern. But a large number of the crew were able to leap into the water and save themselves, and were then picked up by other vessels. So they were lucky, because Landing Craft Gun 102 on the south side went in and beached. And again, Pugsley gives the best description, and I'll explain why in a moment. But he said that, if I can find it now, I probably can't. Should have marked that page, shouldn't I? I know it reasonably well anyway. Basically, they went into the beach and they poured fire on the pillbox that was just in front of them again. But then the craft was seen to catch fire. But then men of the crew were seen to be working to extinguish the flames, and two of the smaller landing craft support came alongside, and then a third one, and they helped to try and extinguish the fire. And soon 102's guns were seen to be in action again. But then she was hit again, and there was a very large explosion. And the three landing craft support that had gone in alongside were also silenced. And it wasn't until a few hours later that one of the smaller landing craft personnel rescue boats went in to try and recover casualties. And they found only one person alive from all four vessels. The entire crew of LCG 102 had been killed. So that they could knock out this pillbox. So they literally sacrificed themselves to secure this side of the beach, to make sure that the landing area was secure.
That is, yeah. Sorry, we had a quick question. I do want to get to it. Yeah. It's a good one from Marin about why the rockets.
Yeah, so the landing craft rockets, I mean, they're incredibly inaccurate. So they have a fixed sort of range, but it's not always guaranteed. Wind conditions will affect that. Things like damp in the cordite and that kind of thing. But the commanders appear to have suffered a radar malfunction. They were all being orientated by one radar, which didn't get the correct range, and so they were fired too early. And so they fell amongst the attacking forces. So it's technical fault, I suppose, is the best way to describe it.
Yeah, it's very fortunate that there seemingly were no casualties from, because I mean, just a quick aside, D-Day, I know there's lots of casualties.
So they did fall some of the vessels. There's that aircraft that was knocked out of the sky, although that was an unfortunate accident more than anything else. and you certainly had shorts from the Landcraft rocket, and also the self-propelled field artillery regiments that were firing from the decks of landing craft as they went in. And probably there were more blue-on-blue instances from those on D-Day than from the rockets. But understandably, because when you're on a landing craft tank that's pitching and rolling all over the place, an accurate fire is practically impossible. The idea that they would be able to knock out any targets wasn't really the point. It was more that they would make the Germans keep their heads down.
It's more of a exactly. Okay, if you should get back to this so we can start to wrap up.
So the landing craft support were all basically, most of those were knocked out as well. So of the 6 that took part, 3 were sunk and 1 was very, very badly damaged and I think written off. And then even then, after that, the chaos didn't really end for the landing craft either. So the units that are landing troops now come into trouble as well. And there's a bit of video footage of this as well. You can skip the next slide. We'll drive straight off the ramp and take the infantry inland. And that was very successful. But of course, the landing craft tanker exposing themselves to all sorts of danger as well. And not just in that initial landing either. So the next slide shows how the sort of breakout happens. Basically, 47 and 48 Commando strike out to the south, and 41 Commando heads north. And they managed to establish very small beachheads. But back on the beach is somewhat chaotic. So a lot of the armor that lands immediately behind the infantry struggles to actually negotiate the breach in the dike and get up the dikes walls themselves. There is a very famous photo of a Sherman crab flail coming ashore, which I've got in the next slide, and there's also a bridge layout behind it. But you can see the terrain that they're having to traverse, and it's really not easy, even for tanks with tracks to get on. And the landing craft now are starting to come in for some punishment as well. In the next slide, there's a report from one of the landing craft that shows the trouble they had. So the time is obviously an error. The craft arrived on the beach at West Kapelle at approximately 3 a.m. That's a mistake somewhere. Started to discharge. I think it's supposed to be 12 o'clock. Started to discharge ammunition, petrol, and more Royal Marine Commandos. Now, this is vital to understand. This little beachhead that's been established by sea is the only way they can be replenished. They cannot link up with Allied forces for a while yet. Everything needs to come in by sea. At about 3 o'clock, when half the stores have been loaded, the heavy surf caused the craft to breach on the beach, and both engines were knocked out in the surf. Basically, the interesting bit is they had to abandon the ship, and then at the very bottom, that final line, it is believed an army film unit photographed the craft on the beach, and that belief is correct because the next slide shows the same LCT actually beached on the side. LCT 324 was written off after this, and never used again. For the landing craft infantry, the risks were much the same, and I think about 4 of these were sunk. And we'll skip through the story of it. But yeah, basically several of these carrying 41 and I think 48 Commando were lost as a result of the operations they were taking part in. And this one, LCI 532 actually got away from the beach. She landed her troops and then sailed back out. It's not the same one. Sorry, I couldn't find a picture of 532, but that's what she would have looked at. But she was hit by a shell while she was making the landing, but then managed to get back out to sea. And while she was transferring wounded to a hospital ship, her petrol tanks exploded. So even though they'd got away from the beach, they weren't even under fire. It was a fire that broke out on the vessel as a result of the damage she sustained, and then she blew up and sank a few hours later. So even after the initial landings, these landing craft are having to keep going back to keep resupplying the beachhead. But the beach really is in chaos because of the nature of the terrain they've got to operate on. And the next slide shows some of the problems the armor had just trying to get off of the shore, which is the seawalls. The dikes, of course, are made up of huge piles of sort of stone rubble, as they are today, which is not easy for tanks to traverse. It's a bit like Dieppe all over again.
Yeah, I was going to say, as Dieppe showed, it's not easy.
Yeah. But what is happening is that the immediate support being provided by the Canadian hospital units is being established. So they set up a field hospital just inside the dike, just next to West Kapelle, and then 10 field surgery unit, field ambulance unit, then sets up its own site on the outside of the dike, on the sea side, which I'm pretty sure is what the next photograph shows.
Right.
There's a POW cage in the foreground. But I'm pretty sure that's the field hospital in the background. And they pretty much have to do all of the medical operations, because the next thing to happen to cause chaos with this beachhead is storms. Right. And these storms threaten to shut off and cut off this little beachhead because the landing craft can't actually get in. And there is a severe danger at this point of the operation going awry because there is no way to resupply the troops or evacuate the casualties. And the next slide is a report from one of the commanders of one of the follow-up units that's going to land a few days later. And they say, you'll see there, the principal beachmaster had to make this very difficult decision of whether to call in landing craft, being fully aware that they would probably be wrecked on the beach if he brought them onto the shore in these newly whipping up storm force conditions. And on D+2, that was his best opportunity. So he called them in, even though he knew they were going to probably beach, and they did. And 3 landing craft in this report are described as being a total loss. 7094, sister to 7074. 1056 and 469 I think was written off. And basically, for the next couple of days the landing craft are really suffering as they try and resupply this beachhead, because they can't abandon the Royal Marines after they've landed. They need to keep resupplying them. And very briefly, we're nearly at the end, everyone. The next slide shows the commandos securing West Kapelle. There's the very famous lighthouse. I think this is 41 Commando, advancing and capturing West Kapelle. And then over the next couple of days, on the next slide, on the 3rd, the 47 and 48 Commando heading southeast have met up with 4 Commando down near Flushing, Vlissingen. Meanwhile, units are starting to break out. The 155 Brigade are starting to break out north from Vlissingen, and the Canadians are starting to break out from the causeway. And then over the next couple of days, all of the commandos are transferred back up to West Kapelle, ready to advance northeast up the northwest side of Walcheren Island. And the next slide shows these advances. Basically, the 155 Brigade managed to break up to Middelkerk, whilst the commandos are heading up to the top of the island, and the Canadians are coming inland on that sort of drier land from the causeway. And basically, most people know this, on the 6th, Middelkerk surrenders. The Germans throw in the towel to a very small force, a scratch force that has managed to get into the town itself. And 2 days later, the batteries up in the very north of the island surrender as well. And so Walcheren is essentially captured and silenced on the 8th of November. So it took 8 days to capture it, which isn't bad going because it's still quite a big island. But of course, once the Allies had more than a toehold, once they had a proper foothold on the island, they weren't going to be easily pushed off. And the Germans had no way to resupply their own forces, so they were slowly dwindling and slowly losing momentum. There's a couple of slides just at the end, which I thought I'd mention just to wrap up with. So there is a sort of memorial at West Kapelle. There is this landing craft, a fiberglass 1980s Dutch LCA Mark II, which is just behind the dike, just outside the village. And as you can see, it's been given the pennant LCT 737, which would appear to be a tribute to the next photograph, which is indeed LCT 737 landing these Hobart's funnies. 737 survived, was paid off at the end of the war. Now, I've heard it said that the more well-known memorial, which is the tank on the top of the dike outside West Kapelle in the next slide, allegedly was also supposed to have been on 737. Now, whether that's true or not, I haven't dug down deeply enough to check if this tank was on that landing craft, which might explain why they chose 737 as the pennant for the landing craft down below. Right. There's a very nice memorial. But I think my favourite memorial is the one in Vlissingen, as a memorial to 4 Commando and 155 Brigade, which is a very striking memorial, positioned right on Uncle Beach, right where the commandos came ashore. So, all in all, a very successful amphibious operation. The Vlissingen landings, a very successful sort of commando raid. But the landings at West Kapelle really achieved through the sacrifice of support squadron eastern flank, and this landing craft gun unit that had achieved so much on the trout line, defending the eastern flank of the invasion beaches on D-Day, and then basically going to its death. 20 vessels by the end of the day. Of its 25 armed vessels, 20 of those were sunk or completely out of action. Only a handful escaped with no damage. I think three escaped with no damage.
That's hardly that's a very small number. So yeah, I think that's a good takeaway from this. Is it's a kind of a tale of two landings, and then also, as you say, the role of the squadron and the sacrifices is a great way. Sorry, there is one quick question. It was a while back, but about the Buffaloes landing. Are they swimming ashore or are they wading ashore?
They're pretty much wading, because the water isn't massively deep, so they're probably touching bottom. I mean, a buffalo, its traction through the water is using its tracks, which are shaped like sort of scoops. So it doesn't make a huge amount of difference whether it's touching bottom or not. It doesn't need to engage different drive. I think they're just wading,
which would make sense given the terrain, which makes perfect sense. All right, that was really good. Do you have anything else, or is that kind of the final?
That was it. Sorry, that went on a bit, didn't it? But that was the main thing I wanted to talk about, really. So I being a landing craft aficionado, of course, I was naturally drawn to the stories of the landing craft, and also just reminding people that the story doesn't start when the troops hit the beach, which is so often the case with our histories of amphibious operations, and D-Day especially. This thing that D-Day starts when the infantry land. There's this whole element out at sea. A whole 50% of an amphibious operation is what's happening at sea, and the trials and tribulations that they face just to get the troops ashore. And it is so marked here at West Kapelle with this sacrifice by support squadron eastern flank to actually achieve that landing, that this is a really good opportunity to sort of tell that story of the Navy's part, and the unsung heroes of landing craft crews actually making that a success.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing part of just this operation, but generally, because again, as we said, Normandy comes up a few times in the discussion, and that's something I've taken away from the work I've started to do with this channel, is trying to understand things that aren't so well understood, and that kind of came across for me when I was doing stuff with Juno when the first Azars landed and all the issues with the DD tanks and everything. But anyway, so this was great. Thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed this and I learned so much.
Very welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry it was delayed so many times. Just so good. Looking through the comments, I can see a couple of things. So Trent has mentioned that an LCIL carries a full infantry company, which is true. Fortunately, they were all sunk on the way out, so they managed to get their troops ashore. So they were all either sunk or very badly damaged on their return to the sea. So it was actually they sustained most of their damage on the beach and then sink as they pull out, because they've been
which seems to be an unfortunate trend in all of this.
Yeah, so fortunately there weren't huge losses amongst the commandos during the landing. They of course sustained absolutely terrible casualties ashore.
Mhm.
And I vaguely recall reading one of the reports from the Canadian Medical Services that Ostend processed something like 500 casualties in the first 2 days, just
Yeah.
coming from the beaches at West Kapelle, including Navy crew and also commandos who were being evacuated. So yeah, very heavy losses to secure this, probably out of all proportion to the numbers involved. So,
Yeah.
and by that I mean that the percentage of casualties is probably much higher for this operation than it was for D-Day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think so. I mean, from everything I've read. But yeah. Anyway, that's another thing. We're at the end, so we'll tab that. Maybe we'll talk about that another time. But so thanks again. That was really great. I'm just going to do a quick send off, and then I'll come back and say goodbye to you.
Okay. Cheerio, everyone.
So thanks everyone for watching. This was a great show. I really, really enjoyed that one. Thanks for sticking with us through the delays and going over the typical hour that we aim for. It's usually worth it when we go over though, and I think this is kind of the case that proves the point there. So thanks everyone for watching. If you really enjoyed this show and are not yet subscribing, please do. Every subscriber does a lot of help for me in building up the channel, and because it helps me reach more people who can also subscribe and everything, and just keeps kind of going. Also, if you do want to keep seeing stuff like this, you can help me out through Patreon or buy me a coffee. Links are in the description below. It's very, very helpful to keep running. I am just one person. I can't do all this by myself, though. I need a little more help to keep this stuff going, especially into the new year. I do have some plans, but I'm just going to need some more support to make sure that that happens into the new year. So this is a really crucial period for me to see if I can keep this stuff going. So any help you can give me is very, very, very appreciated. So thanks again for everyone. For watching today. So thanks again, Stephen, for coming on and all that knowledge. I mean, that was an overload in a good way. I got so many things to think about now and all of this. So that was good. That was a great one. So thanks again, everyone, for watching. And tomorrow we got another one with Jenny Grant about Canadian-Polish relations in Northwest Europe. That's going to be a good one. Same time as this one started. So we'll see everyone